The Amazon rainforest covers an area larger than the entire continental United States west of the Mississippi. It has no road signs, no trail markers, no two trees that look meaningfully different from 100,000 others stretching in every direction. Search and rescue teams equipped with GPS, satellite communication, and years of professional wilderness training have entered that jungle and gone missing inside it. In some documented cases, permanently. Amazon tribes do not get lost. Not occasionally, not usually, with rare exceptions, essentially never across recorded anthropological history. And the reason has almost nothing to do with the explanation most people assume when they first hear this fact. The first assumption people reach for is familiarity. That Amazon tribal hunters simply know their territory the way a person knows their own neighborhood. A mental map built from years of repetition along the same limited set of paths. That explanation works reasonably well for a 5-kilometer radius surrounding a village. It completely fails to explain the documented cases that drew sustained attention from anthropologists and, eventually, military researchers. Hunters traveling 40 kilometers or more through genuinely unfamiliar, visually uniform jungle with no prior exposure to that specific stretch of territory, and returning with a level of precision that has no comparable equivalent anywhere in trained Western navigation methodology. What researchers eventually identified, after years of close observation, is not memorization in any conventional sense. It is a fundamentally different way of processing environmental information, one that integrates dozens of simultaneous signals into a single continuous perception, rather than relying on any individual reference point the way a compass needle or a fixed landmark functions in Western navigation. Anthropologist and linguist Harriet Minks, who spent 3 years living among and documenting the wayfinding practices of the Matsés people in the Javari Valley along the Brazil-Peru border, described the underlying process as something closer to a sense than a learned skill in the conventional meaning of that word. She compared it to the way a person does not consciously calculate balance while walking across uneven ground, yet is constantly processing an enormous volume of continuous sensory information from the inner ear, the eyes, and proprioceptive feedback from the muscles, all without ever directing conscious attention toward the process itself. Amazon navigation, she argued, operates on a structurally similar principle, except the sensory inputs being continuously integrated are external rather than internal. Wind, sound, vegetation, light, and dozens of other environmental variables processed simultaneously and automatically. The individual components of this navigational sense are identifiable on their own, even though their full integration is what makes the complete skill so resistant to direct replication by outsiders. Wind direction is tracked continuously throughout a journey, not as a single isolated check performed once at departure. Prevailing wind patterns within a given region of jungle tend to remain relatively consistent across the course of a single day, even when the dense canopy overhead makes the sky itself almost entirely invisible from ground level. An experienced hunter maintains a running, background awareness of wind direction, the way a sailor unconsciously tracks the angle of the wind against a sail without needing to stop and deliberately check it. Canopy density shifts in patterns that correlate closely with elevation changes and proximity to water sources, providing a constant low-level signal about general position relative to known geographic features, even in the complete absence of visible landmarks. The direction and changing intensity of water sound, audible from a considerable distance often well before any stream or river becomes visible through the vegetation, provides another continuous reference point that experienced hunters track without conscious, deliberate effort. In much the same way, a person walking through a familiar city unconsciously orients toward the sound of traffic on a known main road. Then, there is the layer of information that most outside observers, even trained ones, do not initially think to consider: biological indicators distributed across the landscape. Specific bird species produce different call patterns depending on the time of day and recent predator activity in their immediate area, creating an auditory map of the jungle that shifts in genuinely predictable, learnable ways across a given territory. Leafcutter ant colony locations remain stable across multiple years in most cases, functioning as fixed reference points in much the same way a Western navigator might rely on a permanent man-made landmark. The growth pattern, density, and species composition of vegetation changes gradually and consistently across a landscape in ways that correlate directly with soil type, drainage patterns, and elevation, producing a kind of botanical gradient that an experienced eye learns to read almost the way an experienced hiker reads visible elevation change on open terrain. No single one of these signals, evaluated in isolation, would be sufficient to navigate reliably across genuinely unfamiliar terrain. Wind direction shifts and can mislead. Water sound becomes unreliable at greater distances and can bounce unpredictably off dense vegetation. Bird call patterns vary for reasons unrelated to geographic position. What makes the complete system function with the precision researchers documented is that an experienced hunter processes all of these signals simultaneously and continuously, constantly cross-referencing them against one another in real time, building and updating an internal spatial model that does not depend on any single point of failure. Unlike Western navigation tools, where a lost compass, a dead GPS battery, or an obscured sky represents a complete and immediate failure of the entire navigational system. This distributed, redundant structure is also precisely why the skill has proven so resistant to being taught directly through formal instruction, in the way a classroom curriculum or a structured short course typically transmits a defined body of knowledge. Researchers working in extended collaboration with the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine spent years studying this exact capability, motivated by the practical hope that a teachable methodology could be extracted and used to meaningfully improve navigation training for military personnel operating in jungle environments where GPS access could not be guaranteed. What the research ultimately uncovered instead was something closer to a developmental ceiling than a transferable technique. The level of simultaneous integration required to process this many continuous environmental signals into reliable real-time spatial awareness appeared to depend heavily on a specific kind of neurological pattern formation that begins in early childhood. A developmental window characterized by significantly elevated neuroplasticity, during which the brain is able to form dense, automatic, deeply interconnected associative networks far more readily than it can later in life. This finding draws a close and well-supported parallel to extensively documented research on language acquisition. Children exposed to multiple languages before the onset of puberty typically achieve genuinely native-level fluency across all of them, processing each language with an automaticity that requires no conscious translation or deliberate grammatical calculation. Adults attempting to learn a second language after that same developmental window has closed almost universally, retained detectable patterns. An accent, subtle grammatical hesitations, a perceptible gap between fluency and true native processing, regardless of how many years of dedicated study and practice they invest. The researchers studying Amazon navigation concluded that something structurally analogous appeared to be occurring with environmental and spatial cognition specifically, which would make this capability less a skill that could be efficiently taught to motivated adults, and more a developmental capacity that needed to be cultivated from early childhood in order to reach its full expression. Among the Matsés, this developmental process begins almost as soon as a child becomes physically capable of walking any meaningful distance. Children accompany experienced adult hunters on short, low-stakes excursions years before they are ever expected to navigate independently or bear any real responsibility for the outcome of the journey. Throughout these early years, they are continuously, passively absorbing the fully integrated sensory framework that governs Amazon navigation through direct, repeated exposure, long before any formal expectation of independent competency is placed on them, and without anything resembling a structured curriculum, a defined lesson plan, or a formal test of acquired knowledge. There is simply accumulated, deeply embodied familiarity built across years with a process that, once it has fully developed, operates almost entirely below the threshold of conscious, deliberate thought. What makes this entire body of research genuinely significant extends well beyond the simple observation that Amazon tribes possess an unusually impressive navigational skill. It is what that skill reveals, more broadly, about the real limitations embedded in how the modern world generally approaches the relationship between expertise and formal, structured training. The default instinct, whenever Western institutions encounter a human capability this impressive, is to assume it can ultimately be reverse-engineered, broken down into discrete and clearly teachable components, and then transferred efficiently to a new adult learner through a sufficiently well-designed and adequately resourced instructional program. That underlying assumption shapes nearly every form of modern professional training, from medicine to aviation to military preparation. The extended Amazon navigation research, conducted in partnership with military institutions, suggested a meaningful and genuinely uncomfortable exception to that broader assumption. Not because the underlying knowledge itself is somehow mystical, inherently secretive, or fundamentally inaccessible to outsiders, but specifically because the developmental window required to fully integrate that knowledge appears to close well before most adult training interventions are capable of meaningfully addressing it. This does not mean the skill is entirely unteachable in every possible form or to every possible degree. Specific isolated elements of it, heightened attention to wind and water, sound as navigational cues, basic botanical and biological indicators, increased general awareness of environmental signals as a category of usable navigational data, were successfully incorporated into expanded military survival training curricula and did produce measurable documented improvements in trainee navigation performance when compared directly against previous training standards. But the complete, fully integrated capability, the specific kind that allows an experienced Matsés hunter to travel 40 kilometers through entirely unmarked jungle terrain and return within minutes of his own previously estimated travel time, remained consistently and significantly out of reach for adult learners across the full duration of the research period. Regardless of training length, instructional quality, or institutional resources invested in attempting to close that gap. For Amazon tribes themselves, none of this research findings would have come as particularly new information, even if the specific neuroscientific framing was unfamiliar. They had never conceptualized their navigational ability as a discrete technique meant to be transmitted primarily through formal instruction, because their entire underlying system of knowledge transfer already operated on exactly the principle that outside research eventually confirmed through years of careful comparative study, that this kind of deeply integrated environmental awareness has to be grown gradually across the full span of childhood, absorbed slowly and repeatedly through years of low-stakes, embodied exposure rather than installed efficiently through any amount of structured adult training, however rigorous or well-funded that training might be. The world's largest rainforest has no road signs and no trail markers anywhere within its enormous, largely undocumented expanse, and it does not require any for the people who grew up learning to read it from early childhood onward. What looks from the outside like an extraordinary and almost inexplicable navigational gift is, from the inside, simply how the jungle has always been experienced by the people who belong to it. Not as a disorienting maze that must be solved or conquered through external tools, but as a continuously legible environment that, to a mind shaped by it from the very beginning, never actually stopped making clear and consistent sense.